The gunshot echoed through the marble halls of the Moretti estate like a death knell, and Isabella Romano, 73 years old, with arthritic hands and eyes that had seen too much, knew with terrible certainty that she had been right all along. The young master was dying on the library floor, blood pooling beneath his expensive suit, and not one person in this godforsaken house had listened when she'd tried to warn them. 3 days earlier, Isabella had been exactly where she'd been for the past 42 years, in the kitchen of the Moretti mansion, her domain of copper pots and the smell of rising dough. Her hands, gnarled with age but still steady when it mattered, kneaded bread the way her mother had taught her in their village outside Naples a lifetime ago. The rhythmic motion was meditative, familiar, a small pocket of peace in a house that thrummed with violence just beneath its polished surface. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She'd been with the Moretti family since before Dante Moretti was born, had held him as a screaming infant, bandaged his scraped knees when he was a reckless boy, watched him transform into the cold, calculating man who now ruled Boston's underworld with an iron fist. Isabella had seen 3 generations of Moretti men, and she understood something that everyone else in this house had forgotten. The old ways still mattered. Signs still mattered. And when death was coming for someone in this family, she could feel it in her bones the way other women felt approaching storms. The kitchen door swung open, and Dr. Adrian Chen walked in. All 28 years of cocky confidence and Harvard Medical School arrogance. He was new to the Moretti payroll, hired 3 months ago when the family's longtime physician finally retired. Young, brilliant, and completely dismissive of anything that didn't come from a medical textbook. "Mrs. Romano," he said with that patronizing smile she'd grown to despise. "Mr. Moretti wanted me to check on his son's medication schedule. Marco's been complaining of headaches again." Isabella's hands stilled in the dough. Marco Moretti, 26 years old, Dante's only child and heir to an empire built on blood and loyalty. She'd practically raised the boy after his mother died in childbirth. Marco was the closest thing Isabella had to a grandson, and for 3 nights running, she'd been dreaming of white lilies and black water. Death omens. The same dreams she'd had before Marco's mother passed, before Dante's father was murdered, before her own husband's heart gave out in their bed 20 years ago. "You need to check his heart," Isabella said, meeting the doctor's eyes with the kind of directness that made younger people uncomfortable. "Something's wrong with his heart," Dr. Chen's smile tightened. "Mrs. Romano, with all due respect, I've run every test available. Marco's headaches are tension-related, probably stress from his work with his father. His heart is perfectly healthy." "No," Isabella wiped flour from her hands with deliberate slowness. "You're wrong. I've seen this before. The headaches, the way he touches his chest when he thinks no one's looking, how pale he gets after climbing stairs. His heart is failing, and if you don't find out why—" "Mrs. Romano," Dr. Chen interrupted, his tone growing sharp with irritation. "I understand you've been with this family for a long time, but I'm a trained cardiologist. Marco's EKG was normal. His blood pressure is slightly elevated, which is expected given his lifestyle. But there's nothing wrong with his heart." Isabella felt the old anger rising in her chest, the same frustration she'd battled for decades when men dismissed her because she was a woman, a servant, old. 3 nights, I've dreamed of white lilies. 3 nights, I've seen black water closing over his head. In my village, we understood what this meant. "Superstition," Dr. Chen said flatly. "Look, I appreciate your concern for Marco, but medical decisions need to be based on science, not dreams and old wives' tales." He turned toward the door, already dismissing her. "I'll make sure his migraine prescription is adjusted. That should handle the headaches." "You'll kill him," Isabella said quietly. the words dropping like stones into still water. "Your arrogance will kill that boy as surely as a bullet." Dr. Chen paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. But then his professional mask slid back into place. "I think you should focus on your cooking, Mrs. Romano, and leave the medical care to trained professionals." After he left, Isabella stood in her kitchen surrounded by the smell of yeast and disappointment, feeling the weight of her 73 years like never before. She'd survived poverty in Italy, immigration to America, 42 years of serving a family that dealt in death, burying her husband and both her children. She'd survived by trusting her instincts, by listening to the whispers that came in dreams and the knowledge passed down from her grandmother, a woman who'd been called Strega, witch, by the fearful villagers but who'd saved more lives with her herbs and intuition than any doctor. Isabella knew what she had to do. If the doctor wouldn't listen, she'd go to Dante himself. The Moretti Patriarch's office was on the 3rd floor, a room of dark wood and darker secrets, where men came to make deals that would never see the light of day. Isabella had been inside exactly 3 times in 4 decades, once when she was first hired, once to tell Dante his father had been shot, and once to inform him his wife was in labor. She didn't go to this room lightly. She climbed the stairs slowly, her knees protesting each step, but her resolve ironclad. Outside Dante's office, 2 men in expensive suits stood guard, Tony and Luca, professionals who'd been with the family for years. They knew Isabella, respected her in the way that only men who'd eaten her cooking for years could. "He's in a meeting, Mrs. Romano," Tony said, not unkindly. "Maybe come back later?" "It's about Marco," Isabella said simply. "It can't wait." Something in her tone must have conveyed the urgency because Tony knocked once, opened the door slightly, and murmured something Isabella couldn't hear. A moment later, she was being ushered into the lion's den. Dante Moretti sat behind a desk that had belonged to his grandfather, a massive thing of mahogany and brass that seemed designed to dwarf everyone who stood before it. At 48, Dante was still handsome in the brutal way of men who'd built empires through fear and respect. His black hair showed distinguished threads of silver, and his dark eyes missed nothing. Sitting across from him were 2 other men, Alessandro Vitale, underboss and Dante's right hand, and the family's consigliere, an elderly lawyer named Giuseppe who'd been navigating legal waters for the Morettis since Dante was a child. "Isabella," Dante said, and his voice carried genuine warmth. "This must be important if you're coming all the way up here." She'd known this man since he was in diapers. She'd earned the right to speak plainly. "It's Marco. He's in danger, and no one's listening." Alessandro exchanged a glance with Giuseppe. Dante's expression shifted to concern. "What kind of danger? Has someone threatened him?" "Not from outside," Isabella said. "From inside. His heart. Something's wrong with his heart, and that new doctor is too proud to see it." She watched Dante's face carefully, saw the exact moment when concern transformed into polite dismissal. "Isabella, Dr. Chen is one of the best cardiologists in the country. He's examined Marco thoroughly." "He's examined Marco with machines," Isabella interrupted, knowing she was crossing lines but unable to stop herself. "But he hasn't looked at him with his eyes. I've seen this before, Dante. Your son is dying, and everyone's too busy trusting test results to see what's right in front of them." "Mrs. Romano," Giuseppe said gently, his old voice carrying decades of practiced diplomacy, "we appreciate your dedication to this family, but medical science has come a long way since the old country. Perhaps it's time to trust—" "I've been dreaming of white lilies," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. 3 nights running. The same dreams I had before your mother died, Dante, before your father was shot, before— Enough." Dante's voice was quiet but absolute. He stood, moving around the desk with the controlled grace of a predator. When he reached Isabella, he placed both hands on her shoulders with genuine affection. "Isabella, you've been part of this family longer than anyone. I know you love Marco like he was your own, but you're letting superstition cloud your judgment." "It's not superstition. Marco is fine," Dante said firmly. "Dr. Chen has assured me that the headaches are stress-related. We're managing it. I need you to trust the professionals we've brought in to help." Isabella looked into the eyes of the boy she'd raised and saw a wall she couldn't scale. Dante Moretti might love his son desperately, but he was also a man who'd built an empire on certainty and control. He couldn't afford to believe in dreams and portents, not when hard data told him everything was fine. "If something happens to him," Isabella said quietly, "it will be because everyone in this house was too modern, too educated, too proud to listen to an old woman who's seen death coming more times than all of you combined." She turned and walked out before anyone could respond, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she'd failed. In the hallway, she passed Marco himself, coming out of his own suite of rooms. The young man looked pale, drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Mrs. Romano," he said, with genuine warmth, bending to kiss her cheek in the old Italian way. "I was just coming down to see if you'd made any of your biscotti." She studied his face, noting the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the mansion's perfect climate control, the way his hand unconsciously rubbed at his chest. "Marco, when you have these headaches, where exactly does it hurt?" He blinked, surprised by the intensity of her question. Usually here," he gestured to his temples, "but sometimes it radiates down to my jaw and neck. Dr. Chen says it's migraines. Why?" Isabella's blood ran cold. Jaw pain, neck pain, classic signs of cardiac distress that everyone was misreading as migraine symptoms. "Marco, I need you to listen to me carefully. You need to see a different doctor, a specialist, someone who will look beyond the obvious." "Isabella," Marco said gently, that same patronizing warmth she'd gotten from everyone else. "I appreciate your concern, really, but I've had every test imaginable. I'm fine, just working too hard, like always." He squeezed her shoulder. "Now, about those biscotti." She watched him walk away. This boy she'd raised, this young man who was the closest thing to family she had left in the world, and felt the crushing weight of helplessness. Everyone thought she was just a superstitious old woman, too stuck in the old ways to understand modern medicine. But Isabella knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that came from 7 decades of watching death circle the people she loved, that Marco Moretti was running out of time. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room on the first floor of the mansion, modest but comfortable, a lifetime of loyalty rewarded with privacy and respect, and listened to the house settle around her. At 2 a.m, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Young, male, trying to be quiet, Marco, probably heading to the kitchen for a midnight snack the way he'd done since he was a teenager. Isabella pulled on her robe and followed, maternal instinct overriding exhaustion. She found him in the kitchen, leaning heavily against the counter, his face unnaturally pale in the dim light from the refrigerator. "Marco?" He turned, and she saw it immediately. The pain etched into every line of his face, the way he clutched his chest, the shallow, rapid breathing. "Isabella," he managed, "I don't feel—" He collapsed. Isabella moved faster than she had in 20 years, catching him before his head could crack against the marble floor, easing him down as gently as her old arms could manage. His eyes were wide with fear and confusion, and his lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made her heart stop. "Help!" Isabella screamed, her voice carrying through the mansion like a siren. "Someone help! Marco's having a heart attack!" Within seconds, the kitchen flooded with people, security guards, household staff, and finally Dante himself, barefoot and wild-eyed, dropping to his knees beside his son. Dr. Chen appeared moments later, his face still creased with sleep, his professional mask slipping when he saw Marco's condition. "Call 911, the doctor barked, already beginning chest compressions. "Now!" Isabella watched from where she'd been gently pushed aside, her hands shaking, her heart screaming, "I told you! I told you! I told you!" She watched Dante's face crumble as he held his son's hand, watched Dr. Chen work with frantic efficiency, watched the ambulance arrive and rush Marco away into the night with sirens wailing. At the hospital, they discovered what Isabella had known in her bones for days. Marco had a rare genetic heart condition, one that didn't show up on standard tests, one that caused symptoms everyone had mistaken for migraines and stress. By the time they caught it, his heart was operating at 30% capacity. He needed immediate surgery, and even then, the doctors gave him only a 50-50 chance. Dante Moretti sat in the hospital waiting room like a man carved from stone, and when Isabella approached him with a cup of coffee she'd bullied from the nurse's station, he looked at her with eyes that held a universe of regret. "You tried to tell us," he said, his voice cracking. "God, Isabella, you tried to warn everyone, and we treated you like you were senile." Isabella sat beside him, her old bones aching, her heart heavy. "In my village, the old women were called strega, witches. But they weren't magic, Dante. They just paid attention. They watched. They listened. They trusted what they saw instead of what they were told to see." She placed a weathered hand over his. "Modern medicine is a miracle, truly. But sometimes, the old ways of knowing, of trusting instinct and experience, they still matter." "If he dies," Dante's voice broke completely. "He won't," Isabella said with more confidence than she felt. "He's a Moretti. You don't give up, and neither does he." 7 hours later, Marco came out of surgery. The doctors had implanted a device to regulate his heart rhythm and repaired the damaged tissue they'd found. He would live, but it would be a long recovery. As Isabella stood outside his room, watching through the window as Dante held his unconscious son's hand, she felt a presence beside her. Dr. Chen stood there, his usual arrogance completely absent. "I almost killed him," he said quietly. "I dismissed you. I dismissed your concerns because I thought science had all the answers." "Science does have answers," Isabella said, surprising him. "But science is only as good as the questions we ask and the observations we make. You relied on tests that weren't designed to catch what he had. I relied on 42 years of watching this family, of knowing their history, of trusting what my eyes and instincts told me." She looked at him squarely. "The mistake wasn't in your training, doctor. It was in your pride." He nodded slowly, the lesson landing somewhere deep. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Romano, truly." Isabella accepted his apology with a small nod, then turned her attention back to the window. Marco was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Dante was leaning close, saying something Isabella couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Promises, apologies, vows to do better. As she stood there, Isabella felt the bone-deep exhaustion of her 73 years, but also something else. Vindication, yes, but more than that, a quiet satisfaction that came from saving a life when everyone had told her she was wrong. The old ways, the intuition passed down from her grandmother, the careful observation that came from decades of truly seeing the people around her, all of it had mattered when it counted most. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The waiting room began to empty as dawn broke over Boston, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Most of the Moretti household staff had returned home, reassured that the young master would survive. But Isabella remained, keeping her vigil the way she'd done for every Moretti crisis over 4 decades. She was still sitting there when a woman she'd never seen before walked into the waiting room. The woman was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled into a severe ponytail and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that missed nothing. She wore scrubs, but carried herself like someone accustomed to command. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Isabella with laser focus. "Mrs. Isabella Romano?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a slight accent. "Eastern European, maybe Russian." "Yes," Isabella said carefully. In the Moretti world, strangers asking for you by name was rarely a good thing. The woman sat down in the chair beside her, close enough that their conversation would be private, but not so close as to be threatening. "My name is Dr. Katya Volkov. I'm a cardiologist specializing in genetic heart conditions. I was called in to consult on Marco Moretti's case." She paused, studying Isabella with obvious curiosity. "The attending physician told me something interesting. He said you diagnosed Mr. Moretti's condition without a single medical test based solely on observation and intuition. Is that true?" Isabella felt the familiar defensiveness rising. "I didn't diagnose anything. I just knew something was wrong." "No," Dr. Volkov interrupted gently. "You did more than that. According to Dr. Chen's notes, you specifically identified cardiac involvement when all the test results were normal. You recognized symptoms that trained doctors missed." She leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Romano, what you did was remarkable. I'd like to understand how." For the next hour, Isabella found herself talking to this stranger in a way she hadn't talked to anyone in years. She explained about growing up in rural Italy, about her grandmother who'd been the village healer, about learning to read people's bodies the way others read books. She talked about 42 years with the Moretti family, about learning their patterns and peculiarities, about developing an instinct for when something was wrong that went beyond simple worry. Dr. Volkov listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine respect for Isabella's experience. "There's actually a term for what you do," she said finally. "Medical anthropology calls it embodied knowledge. Understanding that comes from lived experience rather than formal training. It's often dismissed in modern medicine, but in cases like Marco's, where the condition is rare and subtle, that kind of knowledge can be life-saving." "So I'm not just a superstitious old woman?" Isabella said with a hint of bitter humor. "You're a diagnostician," Dr. Volkov said firmly. "Just one who uses different tools than I do. And frankly, Mrs. Romano, the medical profession would do well to learn from people like you instead of dismissing them." As the doctor stood to leave, she handed Isabella a business card. "If you ever notice something concerning about Marco's recovery, I want you to call me directly. No intermediaries, no Dr. Chen, just you, to me. Because I've learned something in 20 years of medicine. Sometimes the people who know patients best are the ones who love them, not the ones who went to medical school." After Dr. Volkov left, Isabella sat alone with those words settling into her bones like warmth. The vindication she'd felt earlier deepened into something more profound, the recognition that her lifetime of observation and intuition had value, real, measurable value, even in a world of MRIs and genetic testing. She was still sitting there when Dante emerged from Marco's room, his face haggard but lighter than it had been hours before. He sat beside her heavily, the weight of the night showing in every line of his body. "He's awake," Dante said quietly. "First thing he asked for was you. Wanted to know if you were okay, if the scare had been too much for your heart." He laughed, the sound painful. "My son almost dies, and he's worried about the woman who saved his life." "That's because you raised him right," Isabella said simply. "For all the darkness in this life you've built, Dante, you gave that boy a good heart, in every sense of the word." They sat in silence for a moment, two people bound by decades of shared history and a love for the young man fighting for his life just rooms away. I need to ask you something, Dante said finally, and I need you to be honest with me. When have I ever been anything else? Fair point. He turned to face her fully. How many other times have you tried to warn me about something, and I dismissed you because I thought I knew better? Isabella considered the question carefully. Dante, you run an empire built on intelligence and strategy. You've survived 3 decades in a world where most men don't last 3 years. Your instincts have kept you alive and powerful. I don't fault you for trusting those instincts more than an old woman's dreams. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give. She met his eyes with all the accumulated wisdom of her 73 years. We've all made mistakes, ignored warnings we should have heeded. The question isn't how many times we've been wrong, it's what we do with the knowledge when we realize it. Dante absorbed this, then stood and offered her his hand. Come on, Marco wants to see you. Marco's hospital room was filled with flowers and the quiet beeping of monitors tracking his heart's every beat. The young man looked impossibly fragile against the white sheets, but his eyes were clear and alert when Isabella entered. There she is, he said, his voice weak but warm. My guardian angel. Isabella moved to his bedside, taking his hand in both of hers. How do you feel, Caro? Like I got hit by a truck. He squeezed her hand gently. Dr. Chen told me everything, about how you'd been warning everyone for days, how you knew it was my heart when all the tests said it wasn't. His eyes filled with tears. Isabella, you saved my life. If you hadn't been there last night. But I was there, Isabella said firmly, and you're going to be fine. You're going to recover, and you're going to live a long life, and someday you're going to tell your own children about the night their grandmother Romano refused to let you die. Marco laughed, then winced at the pain it caused. Grandmother Romano, I like that. As Isabella sat with Marco, Dante standing silent guard by the window, she felt something shift in the room. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was respect. Real, genuine respect for the knowledge she carried, for the ways she knew things that machines and tests couldn't measure. Later, as hospital staff came and went, as specialists consulted and nurses checked vitals, Isabella remained at Marco's side, and she began to notice something she'd been too focused on survival to see before. The way nurses deferred to her observations about Marco's comfort, the way Dr. Volkov made a point of asking her opinion about his color and energy levels, the way even the cardiac specialists paused to listen when she mentioned something seemed off. The old woman, who'd been dismissed and patronized just days ago, had become an integral part of Marco Moretti's care team, not despite her lack of medical training, but because of her lifetime of careful observation and hard-won wisdom. As sunset painted the hospital room in shades of amber, Marco drifted off to sleep, and Dante finally left to handle the business that had been piling up during the crisis. Isabella remained, keeping watch the way she'd done for 42 years, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her keen eyes noting every rise and fall of Marco's chest. She was still sitting there when Dr. Volkov returned, accompanied by a man Isabella had never seen before. He was perhaps 40, devastatingly handsome in the way of men who'd never had to work for attention, with dark hair threaded with silver and eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance. Mrs. Romano, Dr. Volkov said quietly, mindful of Marco's sleep. This is Nikolai Volkov, my brother. He's here about a different matter entirely, but I thought you should meet him. Nikolai extended his hand, and when Isabella took it, she felt calluses that spoke of work harder than pushing papers. Mrs. Romano, my sister tells me you have a remarkable gift for reading people. I just pay attention, Isabella said, immediately wary. This man had danger written all over him, and she'd spent enough time around the Moretti family to recognize it. Perhaps we could speak privately? Nikolai's accent was thicker than his sister's, his English precise, but clearly not his first language. "About a matter that requires exactly the kind of careful observation my sister says you possess." Isabella glanced at Marco, still sleeping peacefully, then at Dr. Volkov, who nodded encouragement. Against her better judgment, she followed the siblings into the hallway. What Nikolai Volkov told her in the next 10 minutes would change everything. Nikolai Volkov's proposal was simple and terrifying in equal measure. Someone within the Moretti organization was planning to kill Dante, and Isabella's unique ability to read people, to see what others missed, might be the only thing that could identify the traitor before it was too late. "Why would I help you?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp despite the exhaustion weighing down her bones. "You're not with the Morettis. You're something else entirely." Nikolai's smile was thin and dangerous. "Very observant, Mrs. Romano." "You're right. I'm not with the Morettis. I'm with people who have a vested interest in keeping Dante Moretti alive. There's a power vacuum forming in Boston's underworld, and if Dante dies now, the resulting war will be catastrophic for everyone involved." "Including you," Isabella said flatly. "Including me." Nikolai didn't bother denying it. "My organization has agreements with the Morettis, treaties that keep the peace between our territories. If Dante falls and his empire fractures, those agreements die with him. We're talking about bodies in the streets, Mrs. Romano. Innocent people caught in crossfire. Children who have nothing to do with our world bleeding out on sidewalks." Isabella felt ice spreading through her chest. She'd spent 42 years in the Moretti household, but she'd always maintained a careful distance from the actual business. She cooked, she cleaned, she loved Marco like her own grandson, but she never asked questions about the men who came and went in the night, about the hushed phone calls, about why certain rooms in the mansion were always locked. "I'm just a maid," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie. After what had happened with Marco, after being proven right when everyone dismissed her, she couldn't hide behind that excuse anymore. "You're the only person in that house who actually sees people," Katya said gently. "My brother is right about the threat, Isabella. Someone close to Dante is planning his murder, and because you exist in the margins, because people talk around you like you're furniture, you might be the only one who can catch them." Isabella thought of Marco, still recovering from surgery that should never have been necessary if people had listened sooner. Thought of Dante, for all his sins, still capable of love and loyalty in a world that usually crushed both. Thought of the 42 years she'd spent building a life within the Moretti walls, the only family she had left since her own children had drifted away, strangers who sent cards at Christmas but never visited. "What do I have to do?" Nikolai's answering smile was full of teeth. "Watch. Listen. Notice the things that don't fit. Someone in Dante's inner circle is making plans, taking meetings they shouldn't, showing loyalty to people who aren't Moretti. You'll know them when you see them, because something will be off. Trust your instincts the way you did with Marco. And when I find them, you tell me." He pressed a card into her hand, identical to the one Katya had given her earlier. "This number reaches me directly, 24 hours a day. When you know who the traitor is, you call, and I handle the rest." Isabella wanted to refuse, wanted to tell these dangerous siblings that she'd spent her entire life avoiding this exact situation. But she thought of Marco sleeping peacefully in that hospital bed, his heart finally beating the way it should, and knew she'd do whatever it took to protect the boy she'd raised. "1 week," she said firmly. "You get 1 week of my help. After that, I'm done with all of this." Nikolai nodded, his expression unreadable. 1 week is all I'll need." Isabella returned to the mansion 3 days later, once Marco was stable enough to be moved to a private recovery suite in the hospital's secure wing. The house felt different when she walked through the kitchen door, or maybe she was different, and everything else had simply stayed the same. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, who managed the rest of the staff, looked up from her tablet with obvious relief. Isabella, thank God. We've been drowning without you. The boss has been impossible, and the staff doesn't know how to handle Marco's dietary requirements for his recovery. I'll take care of it, Isabella said, slipping back into the familiar rhythm of her work like a well-worn coat. But even as her hands moved through the practiced motions of inventory and meal planning, her mind was cataloging everything Nikolai had told her to watch for. Unusual meetings, strange loyalties, patterns that didn't fit. Over the next 72 hours, Isabella moved through the Moretti mansion like a ghost, present but invisible in the way that only longtime servants could manage. She watched Alessandro Vitale, the underboss, take 3 phone calls in the garden where he thought no one could hear. She noticed Giuseppe, the consigliere, meeting with a lawyer she didn't recognize in the study at 2 a.m. She observed Tony and Luca, the guards, having heated, whispered conversations that stopped the moment anyone approached. But it was the 4th day when Isabella saw something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Adrian Chen arrived at the mansion to pick up medical files he'd left behind in his rush to the hospital. Isabella was in the hallway outside Dante's office, polishing the same section of banister she'd already cleaned twice, when the doctor emerged from his brief meeting with the boss. He walked past her without acknowledgement, which was normal. But Isabella's keen eyes caught something that wasn't. A slight tremor in his hands, sweat on his brow despite the mansion's perfect temperature control, and most damningly, the way his fingers kept reaching for his pocket to touch something hidden there, a nervous gesture she'd seen in men about to do something they feared. Isabella maintained her cleaning until Dr. Chen left, then immediately headed for the kitchen where her phone was charging. She was halfway there when Dante's voice stopped her. Isabella. She turned to find him standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. Sir? I need to talk to you about Marco's recovery plan. Dr. Chen just gave me his recommendations, but... He trailed off, and Isabella saw something she'd never seen before in Dante Moretti's face. Uncertainty. I need you to tell me if you think he's right. They talked for 20 minutes, Isabella carefully reviewing Dr. Chen's suggestions for Marco's care while her mind raced with what she'd observed. The recovery plan was solid, medically sound, showing none of the arrogant dismissiveness that had nearly killed Marco. But that tremor in Chen's hands, the fear in his eyes, that spoke of something else entirely. After Dante left to return to the hospital, Isabella finally made it to her phone. She stared at Nikolai's card for a long moment before dialing. He answered on the first ring. What did you find? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Isabella kept her voice low. Dr. Adrian Chen was here. Something's wrong with him. He's scared, nervous, hiding something. The doctor who almost let Marco die? The same. But Nikolai, I don't think this is about medical incompetence anymore. The way he looked, the way he moved, I've seen that before. In men who'd been backed into corners, forced to do things they didn't want to do. There was a long pause on the other end. You think someone's forcing him to work against the Morettis? I think he's terrified, and terrified men do dangerous things. Isabella glanced around the empty kitchen. He has access to Marco, to his medications, his recovery protocols. If someone wanted to finish what the heart condition started, I'll handle it. Nikolai's voice had gone cold. Don't approach Chen. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Just keep watching. But Isabella couldn't just watch. Not when it came to Marco. That evening, she made the drive to the hospital, bringing a container of the soup Marco loved and a determination to see for herself that the boy was safe. She found him in good spirits, color returning to his cheeks, sitting up in bed and arguing with his father about returning to work too soon. The normalcy of it made Isabella's chest ache with relief. Mrs. Romano, Marco's face lit up. Did you bring... Your grandmother's recipe, Isabella confirmed, setting the container on his bedside table. With extra oregano, the way you like it. Dante stood, stretching his back. I'm going to grab coffee. Isabella, you'll stay with him? Of course. After Dante left, Marco's smile faded slightly. You look worried. Is everything okay? Isabella had never been good at lying, especially to this boy. I need to ask you something, Caro. Dr. Chen, has he been acting strangely, different than usual? Marco's brow furrowed. Actually, yeah. He's been really nervous the last couple days. Keeps checking my medications 3 or 4 times, like he's afraid he'll make a mistake. I thought maybe he just felt guilty about missing my diagnosis. Or he's being forced to do something he doesn't want to do, Isabella thought. Has anyone else visited you? Anyone you didn't recognize? Just the usual staff and specialists. Marco studied her face. Isabella, what's going on? You're scaring me. Before she could answer, the door opened. Dr. Chen walked in, medical bag in hand, and froze when he saw Isabella sitting by Marco's bed. The moment stretched like taffy. Isabella watched the doctor's face cycle through. Expressions, surprise, fear, calculation. His hand moved toward his medical bag, and Isabella's instincts screamed danger. I need to check Marco's vitals, Dr. Chen said, his voice too steady, too controlled. Dr. Volkov just did that an hour ago, Isabella said evenly. Surely he doesn't need another check so soon. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. Mrs. Romano, I'm the primary physician on this case. I'll determine when my patient needs examination. Marco looked between them, confusion creasing his features. Guys, is there some kind of problem? No problem. Dr. Chen moved closer to the bed, pulling equipment from his bag. Just routine care, Marco. Mrs. Romano is understandably protective after everything that happened. Isabella stood up, positioning herself between the doctor and Marco's IV line. It was a subtle movement, but Dr. Chen caught it, and she saw his expression shift into something harder. You need to leave, he said to Isabella. Now! I don't think so. Mrs. Romano. Dr. Chen's voice dropped dangerously low. You're interfering with medical care. I can have security remove you. Then call them, Isabella crossed her arms. Because I'm not leaving Marco alone with you until I know exactly what's in that bag. The silence that followed was broken by Marco's sharp intake of breath. The boy wasn't stupid. He'd grown up in the Moretti world, learned to read danger the way other children learn to read books. Isabella thinks you're going to hurt me, he said slowly. Is she right, Dr. Chen? The doctor's composure cracked. His hand, still hovering over his medical bag, began to shake violently. I don't have a choice, he whispered. They have my daughter. They took Emma, and they said if I don't... He broke off, his face crumbling. She's only 6 years old. They showed me pictures, told me exactly what they'd do to her if I didn't make sure Marco's recovery failed. Isabella felt everything slot into place with horrible clarity. Not a willing traitor, but a father forced to choose between his child and his patient. The cruelest kind of trap. Who has her? Isabella demanded. Who took your daughter? I don't know their names. They just said they were taking back what the Morettis stole, that Dante's son dying was justice. Dr. Chen's voice broke completely. I'm a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm, but she's my baby girl, and they're going to kill her if I don't. The door burst open. Dante stood there, his face carved from granite, and Isabella realized with sinking horror that he'd heard everything. Behind him stood Nikolai Volkov and 2 men Isabella didn't recognize, all armed. Step away from my son, Dante said quietly, the kind of quiet that preceded hurricanes. Dr. Chen stumbled backward, his hands raised. Please, Mr. Moretti, please, they have my daughter. She's innocent. She doesn't deserve to die because of your wars. And my son does? Dante's hand moved to the gun at his waist. You were going to murder a boy who's never done anything to you because someone told you to? To save my daughter, Dr. Chen's voice rose to a shout. What would you do, Moretti, if someone had Marco and told you to kill to get him back? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you burn the whole world down? The question hung in the air like smoke. Isabella saw something flicker across Dante's face. Recognition, understanding, the horrible empathy of one father looking at another's impossible choice. Nikolai, Dante said, without looking away from Dr. Chen, can you find the girl? Nikolai stepped forward, his phone already in hand. Give me a name. Give me anything you know about who took her. What followed was a desperate information exchange. Dr. Chen, breaking completely under the weight of his fear and guilt, spilled everything he knew. The men who'd taken Emma had Eastern European accents. They were holding her somewhere in the city, calling him every 6 hours for updates on Marco's condition. They'd told him he had 72 hours to ensure Marco's death, accidentally, through medication error or complication, or they'd start sending him pieces of his daughter. Isabella listened to all of it with growing horror, but also growing clarity. She'd been right about the threat, right about Dr. Chen, but she'd been wrong about the why. This wasn't about betrayal or greed. It was about love twisted into a weapon. As Nikolai's men worked their phones, calling in favors and activating networks Isabella couldn't begin to understand, she moved to Marco's bedside. The boy was pale again, but not from illness, from fear and anger, and the sudden understanding that his life was currency in someone else's game. We're going to find her, Isabella told Dr. Chen quietly. Emma is going to come home safely. How can you promise that? The doctor's voice was hollow. You're a cook. You make soup and clean counters. What power do you have in this world? Isabella met his eyes steadily. I have 42 years of watching this family survive impossible things. I have the trust of a man who would burn cities for his son, and I have the certainty that nobody hurts children while I draw breath. It took Nikolai's organization less than 4 hours to find Emma Chen. She was being held in a warehouse in Southie, guarded by 6 men who'd made the fatal mistake of underestimating how fast the combined forces of the Volkov and Moretti families could move when a child's life was at stake. Isabella wasn't there for the rescue. She stayed at the hospital with Marco, holding the boy's hand as they waited for news, listening to Dante pace the hallway outside like a caged predator. Dr. Chen sat in the corner, his face buried in his hands, prayers in Mandarin falling from his lips like tears. When Nikolai called to confirm Emma was safe, scared but unharmed, the doctor collapsed completely, sobbing with relief so profound it seemed to shake the walls. The men who took her? Dante asked, into the phone, his voice flat and cold. Isabella couldn't hear Nikolai's response, but she saw Dante's expression settle into something that made her glad she'd never seen him conduct actual business. This was the Mafia boss who'd built an empire on fear and respect, and right now he was choosing which one to deploy. No, Dante said finally. Bring them to me alive. I want them to explain why they thought targeting children was acceptable. After the call ended, Dante turned to Dr. Chen. Your daughter will be here within the hour. Nikolai's taking her to a safe house first, making sure she's not injured, then bringing her directly to you. Dr. Chen looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Why? Why would you help me after what I almost did to Marco? Dante was quiet for a long moment. Because someone put you in an impossible position. Because you're a father who'd do anything to save his child, and I understand that better than anyone. His expression hardened. But understand this, Dr. Chen. You're done treating my family. After tonight, you take your daughter, you leave Boston, and you never come back. I'll make sure you have money, new identities, a fresh start somewhere far from this world. But if I ever see you again, father or not, I won't be merciful. It was both forgiveness and exile, mercy and punishment wrapped together. Dr. Chen nodded his acceptance, too shattered to do anything else. Isabella watched it all unfold and felt the final pieces of her understanding fall into place. This was the world she'd observed from the margins for 42 years. A world where love and violence were so tangled together they became indistinguishable. Where fathers made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Where mercy existed but always came with a price. Later, after Dr. Chen had been reunited with his daughter, a tiny girl with dark pigtails who clung to her father like she'd never let go, and after they'd been escorted away to begin their new life, Isabella found herself alone with Dante in Marco's room. The boy had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's revelations. "You were right again," Dante said quietly, his eyes on his sleeping son. "About watching, about trusting instinct. If you hadn't noticed, something was wrong with Chen." "But I didn't notice soon enough," Isabella interrupted. "I saw he was scared, but I didn't understand why until it was almost too late." Almost. Dante's hand found her shoulder, a gesture of respect and affection from a man who rarely showed either. "You saved Marco's life twice in 1 week, Isabella. Once from his heart, once from someone who would have stopped it. I won't forget that." Isabella looked at this man she'd known since he was born. This complicated, dangerous, occasionally tender person who'd built an empire on blood and loyalty. "Dante, I need to tell you something. Nikolai Volkov didn't just happen to be there tonight. He came to me days ago, told me someone in your organization was planning to kill you. He asked me to watch, to identify the traitor." She expected anger, felt prepared for it. But Dante just nodded slowly. "I know. Nikolai and I have an understanding. He watches my back, I watch his. When he said you'd agreed to help, I was relieved. Because if anyone could spot a threat I'd miss, it's the woman who's spent 42 years watching this family like a hawk." "You knew?" Isabella felt something inside her chest unwind. "All this time you knew I was working with him?" "Of course I knew. Isabella, nothing happens in my house without my knowledge." His smile was tired but genuine. "Well, almost nothing. You did manage to diagnose my son's heart condition before my entire medical team, so perhaps I'm not quite as omniscient as I like to believe." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Marco sleep, two people bound by love for a boy who'd survived more in 1 week than most people faced in lifetimes. "The men who took Emma Chen," Isabella said finally. "What will you do to them?" Dante's expression went cold. "They targeted a child to get to me. They put Dr. Chen in an impossible position and nearly caused the death of my son. What do you think I'll do to them, Isabella?" She knew the answer, had always known what kind of man Dante Moretti was beneath the expensive suits and carefully controlled exterior. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me that whatever you do, you make sure the world knows children are off limits, that hurting innocents to get to you brings consequences worse than death." "I promise," Dante said, and Isabella heard the iron oath beneath those words. "By tomorrow morning, every family in every city will understand that the Morettis protect children. All children, even the children of their enemies." It was both beautiful and terrible, mercy and violence, protection and threat. Everything the Moretti family had always been. As Isabella left the hospital that night, her bones aching with exhaustion and her heart heavy with knowledge she'd never wanted, she found Nikolai Volkov waiting by her car. "Your week is up," he said simply. "Unless you'd like to continue working with us?" Isabella looked at this dangerous man with his dangerous smile and thought about everything she'd learned in the past 7 days. About embodied knowledge and watching from the margins. About how sometimes the people everyone ignored were the ones who saw the most clearly. "No," she said firmly. "I helped you find your traitor. I helped save Emma Chen. But I'm done with your world, Nikolai Volkov. I'm going back to my kitchen and my bread and the quiet margins where I belong." Nikolai studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what looked like respect. "If you ever change your mind, you know how to reach me." As Isabella drove back to the Moretti mansion through Boston's dark streets, she thought about choices and consequences, about the price of love in a world built on violence. She thought about Dr. Chen starting a new life somewhere far from here, about Marco recovering and growing stronger, about Dante's promise to protect children, even as he destroyed their captors. Most of all, she thought about how 42 years of being invisible had taught her to see everything, and how that gift had saved lives, but also pulled her deeper into a world she'd always tried to avoid. Tomorrow, she'd return to her kitchen. She'd knead bread and make soup and be the elderly maid everyone dismissed and ignored. But tonight, driving through the darkness with secrets weighing down her heart, Isabella Romano knew the truth. She'd never been invisible at all. She'd simply been watching, waiting, gathering the knowledge that came from a lifetime of careful observation. And when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, that knowledge had been the difference between tragedy and survival. The mansion's lights were warm and welcoming as she pulled into the driveway, and Isabella felt herself drawn back toward the familiar rhythms of her life. But she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. She'd looked directly into the heart of the Moretti Empire, and the empire had looked back. 3 months after the night Emma Chen was rescued, Isabella stood in her kitchen at dawn, hands buried in flour, when she heard the sound that would change everything again. A car door slamming, footsteps on gravel, then Marco's voice, strong and healthy, calling her name with an urgency that made her heart skip. She rushed to the kitchen entrance to find him standing there, no longer the pale, fragile boy from the hospital, but a young man transformed by survival. His color was good, his eyes bright, and he was holding something in his hands, a cream-colored envelope with Isabella's name written in elegant script. "This just arrived by courier," Marco said, slightly breathless. "It's addressed to you, but the seal, Isabella, that's the Calabrese family crest." Isabella's hands stilled, flour dusting the envelope as she took it. The Calabrese family, one of the oldest, most respected crime families in North America, based in Montreal, but with connections that stretched across continents. She hadn't heard that name in over 50 years. "Should I get Papa?" Marco asked, suddenly protective. "No." Isabella's voice came out stronger than she expected. "This is personal." She waited until Marco reluctantly left before opening the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper and a photograph so old it had yellowed at the edges. The photograph showed 2 people, a young woman of perhaps 22 with dark hair and fierce eyes, standing beside a man in his mid-20s whose face was partially turned away, but whose stance radiated the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were in the world. They were holding hands, and even through the decades-old image, Isabella could see the love between them like a living thing. The young woman was her. The man was Antonio Calabrese, heir to an empire she'd fled from a lifetime ago. The letter was brief. "Isabella, I am writing because my grandfather, Antonio Calabrese, is dying. He has perhaps 2 weeks remaining, and in his final days, he speaks only of you, of the woman he loved and lost to his own pride and the violence of our world. He asks if you would grant an old man one final mercy, to see your face once more before he leaves this earth. I understand you built a new life far from ours. I understand why you left. But my grandfather has carried his regret for 53 years, and it is killing him more surely than the cancer in his bones. If there is any compassion left in your heart for the man he was, please come to Montreal. Luca Calabrese." Isabella sank into a chair, the letter falling from her nerveless fingers. Antonio. She hadn't allowed herself to think his name in decades, had buried that part of her life so deep she'd almost convinced herself it never existed. But it had. God, how it had. She was still sitting there an hour later when Dante found her, concern etched across his face. Marco said you received something that upset you. Isabella, what's wrong? For 42 years, Isabella had kept her secrets, had played the role of the devoted maid, the woman with no past, no complications, no life beyond these walls. But looking at Dante now, she realized she was tired of hiding. I need to tell you something, she said quietly, about who I was before I came to work for your family. What Isabella told Dante over the next hour was a story she'd never shared with anyone. How she'd been born Isabella Russo, yes, a distant relation to the very family she now served, in a small village in Calabria. How she'd met Antonio Calabrese when he came to Italy to learn the old ways from the families there. How they'd fallen in love with the intensity only possible when you're young and believe love can conquer anything. How Antonio had asked her to marry him, to return to Montreal and be his wife, the queen of an empire built on blood and power. And how Isabella had said yes, right up until the night she'd watched Antonio order the execution of a man who'd betrayed the family, a man who'd had a wife and 3 young children who would now grow up without a father. I saw what that life would be, Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. I saw the violence and the moral compromises and the way love got twisted into something ugly by the requirements of power. So I ran, changed my name from Russo to Romano, came to America, spent decades building a life as far from that world as possible. And yet, you ended up working for another crime family, Dante said, not unkindly. I thought the Morettis were different, smaller, less ruthless, and by the time I realized you were more similar than different to what I'd left behind, I'd already fallen in love with your father. Not romantically. He was a married man who adored his wife. But I loved him as family, and then I loved you, and then Marco. Isabella met Dante's eyes. I chose this family, Dante, but I chose it on my terms, from the margins, where I could love without being complicit. Dante was quiet for a long moment. And now, Antonio Calabrese wants to see you before he dies. Yes. Will you go? Isabella looked down at the photograph of her younger self, that fierce girl who'd believed she could change the world through love. I don't know. That part of my life has been dead for 53 years. Why resurrect it now? Maybe, Dante said carefully, because some things don't die just because we bury them. That evening, Isabella found herself in an unexpected place, sitting across from Katya Volkov in a quiet cafe far from the Moretti mansion. The doctor had called her, said she needed to discuss something important about Marco's continued care, but when they met, Katya's agenda became clear. Nikolai told me about the letter, the doctor said without preamble. He has connections in Montreal. He knows who Antonio Calabrese is, what he represented. Of course he does, Isabella said tiredly. Your brother seems to know everything. Not everything. He doesn't know why you really left Italy. Katya leaned forward, her intelligent eyes searching Isabella's face. But I think I do. I've spent 20 years watching women in our world, the wives, the daughters, the ones who exist beside men of violence. And I've seen how many of them break under the weight of loving someone whose hands are stained with blood. Isabella's throat tightened. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Katya's voice was gentle. Isabella, you saved Marco's life. You saved Emma Chen's life. You've spent 42 years being the moral center of a family that often has no morals at all. And you did it all while maintaining this careful distance, this insistence that you're just the help, that you don't really belong to their world. She paused. But what if the real reason you never let yourself belong is because you're still punishing yourself for loving Antonio Calabrese? The words hit like a physical blow. Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes, decades of buried guilt and grief suddenly rising to the surface. "I loved him so much," she whispered, "and I hated what he was. How do you reconcile that? How do you love someone whose kindness to you comes from the same hands that pull triggers and order deaths?" "I don't know," Katya admitted, "but I think that's a question Antonio Calabrese has been asking himself for 53 years. And maybe, you both deserve the chance to find an answer before he dies." 2 days later, Isabella found herself on a plane to Montreal, Marco and Dante sitting on either side of her like protective bookends. She'd tried to go alone, but they'd refused. "Your family," Dante had said simply, "and family doesn't face their demons alone." The Calabrese estate was everything Isabella remembered and more, a fortress of old money and older power situated on a sprawling property outside the city. As their car pulled up the circular drive, Isabella felt herself transported back to the young woman she'd been, full of fire and certainty and the belief that love should be simple. Luca Calabrese met them at the door. He was perhaps 40, with his grandfather's strong features and eyes that held both respect and curiosity when he looked at Isabella. "Mrs. Romano, thank you for coming. My grandfather has been waiting." Antonio's bedroom was on the second floor, facing east so he could watch the sunrise. The man lying in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the powerful figure Isabella remembered. Cancer had whittled him down to bones and will, his once dark hair gone completely white, his strong hands now skeletal. But when his eyes opened and found hers, Isabella saw the boy she'd loved looking back at her. "Bella," Antonio whispered, using the name no one had called her in over half a century. "You came." Isabella moved to his bedside on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Up close, she could see the IV lines, the monitors tracking his failing heart, the oxygen tube helping him breathe. "I'm here, Antonio." His hand reached for hers, the grip weak but insistent. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said 53 years ago when you left." He paused, gathering strength. "You were right to go. Everything you saw in me, everything you feared I would become, you were right." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. "Antonio, let me finish, please." He coughed, the sound wet and painful. "I built an empire. I became everything my father wanted me to be. I married a good woman, had children and grandchildren who carry the Calabrese name with pride. But every single day, for 53 years, I've thought about you, about the life we could have had if I'd been brave enough to choose love over power." "You can't rewrite history," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "No, but I can die with the truth spoken." Antonio's eyes held hers with surprising intensity. "I loved you more than anything in this world, Isabella Russo, and my greatest regret, greater than any of the blood on my hands, greater than all the compromises I made for power, is that I wasn't worthy of the love you offered me." Isabella sat beside him for the next 3 hours while Antonio talked. He told her about his life, the wars he'd fought, the alliances he'd built, the moments when he'd almost walked away from it all but couldn't quite manage it. He told her about watching his sons enter the family business and feeling both pride and grief, about holding his grandchildren and praying they'd find a way out that he never could. And he told her about the charity work he'd done in secret for decades. Orphanages funded, children's hospitals, built, scholarships created for kids from neighborhoods like the ones he'd grown up in. "I couldn't be good," he said, "but I could try to balance the scales. You taught me that, Bella. The night you left, you told me that love without morality was just possession. I never forgot." When Dante and Marco finally came to check on her, they found Isabella holding Antonio's hand while he slept, her face peaceful in a way they'd never seen before. "He's dying," Isabella said quietly. "Maybe another week if he's lucky." "Do you want to stay?" Dante asked. Isabella looked at the man who'd been both her greatest love and her deepest regret. "Yes, I think I need to." Over the next 6 days, Isabella kept vigil at Antonio's bedside. Luca Calabrese and his family treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. The woman who'd captured their patriarch's heart and then had the strength to walk away. But it was on the 5th day that Isabella had the conversation that would finally heal something broken inside her. Antonio was having a good day, lucid and alert despite the pain medication, when he asked her about her life. She told him everything. About working for the Morettis, about Marco and Dante, about the 42 years she'd spent building a family from the margins of someone else's empire, about learning to love people whose hands were as stained as Antonio's had been, but choosing to love them anyway because love was complicated and messy and never as simple as she'd once believed. "You found a way to live in this world without being destroyed by it," Antonio said with wonder. "You found the balance I never could." "I found a way to love without losing myself," Isabella corrected gently. "There's a difference." Antonio was quiet for a long moment. "If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still leave me?" Isabella considered the question with the weight it deserved. "Yes," she said finally, "because the woman I needed to become, the one who could save Marco's life, who could see what trained doctors missed, who could build a family on her own terms, that woman was forged by leaving you. If I'd stayed, I would have been someone else. Maybe happy, maybe not, but definitely different. Do you regret loving me?" "Never." Isabella squeezed his hand gently. "Loving you taught me what I was capable of feeling. Leaving you taught me what I was capable of surviving. Both lessons were necessary." Antonio smiled, and for a moment she saw the young man she'd fallen for. "You were always the strongest person I knew, Bella. I just wish I'd been strong enough to deserve you." He died 2 days later, at sunrise, with Isabella holding one hand and his grandson Luca holding the other. His last words were in Italian. "Grazie, mio amore. Thank you for coming back." At the funeral, Isabella stood beside the Calabrese family as they laid Antonio to rest. Luca gave a eulogy that spoke of his grandfather's complexity, the violence and the generosity, the ruthlessness and the love, the way he'd tried to balance darkness with light, even though the scales never quite evened out. Afterward, as people gathered at the estate for the traditional meal, Isabella found herself approached by an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. "You're her," the woman said in accented English. "The one who got away. Antonio spoke of you often, especially in recent years." "Did he?" Isabella was surprised. Antonio had married, had a full life. She'd assumed she was nothing more than a footnote. "Oh, yes. He said you were the conscience he never developed on his own." The woman studied Isabella carefully. "My name is Maria Calabrese. I was Antonio's wife for 48 years, and I want you to know I never resented you. How could I? You made him better. Even in your absence, he spent his life trying to prove he could be worthy of the woman who walked away." Isabella felt the tears prick her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt him." "You didn't. You saved him from becoming something worse." Maria took Isabella's hand. "We can love imperfect men, Cara. We can even build good lives with them. But sometimes, the greatest act of love is knowing when to leave. You gave Antonio something precious, the knowledge that his choices had consequences, that love couldn't survive without integrity. He carried that lesson every day we were together." The flight back to Boston was quiet. Isabella sat between Marco and Dante, feeling lighter than she had in decades. The ghosts of her past had finally been laid to rest, and she understood now that the life she'd built, complicated and messy and lived in the margins of someone else's empire, had been exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she said to both of them as they drove back to the mansion, "for coming with me, for understanding." "Your family," Marco said simply, echoing his father's words from days before. And family shows up. Life returned to its familiar rhythms after Montreal. Isabella resumed her place in the kitchen, kneading bread and making soup and watching the Moretti household from her careful distance. But something had shifted. She no longer felt like she was hiding or running from her past. She'd confronted it, made peace with it, and chosen her present with clear eyes. It was 2 months later when Dante called her into his office for a conversation that would surprise them both. "I'm making some changes to my will," he said without preamble, "and I wanted to discuss them with you first." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Why would your will concern me?" "Because I'm leaving you the house in Tuscany." Isabella felt the breath leave her lungs. The Moretti family owned a villa in Tuscany, a beautiful property that had been in the family for generations, used as a retreat when the pressures of their world became too much. "Dante, I can't accept—" "You can and you will." Dante's voice was firm. "Isabella, you've given 42 years of your life to this family. You saved my son twice. You've been more loyal than soldiers I've paid fortunes to keep happy. That villa is yours, free and clear, to use as you wish. If you want to retire there, spend your final years in peace, that's your choice. If you want to stay here and keep making Marco's favorite soup, that's also your choice. But either way, you'll have a place that's truly yours." Isabella felt tears gathering. "Why now?" "Because Montreal taught me something." Dante leaned back in his chair. "You came back from Antonio Calabresi's deathbed, and you looked free, like you'd finally given yourself permission to stop running, stop hiding, stop pretending you were just the help. I want you to have that freedom completely. No strings, no obligations, just the knowledge that you're family, and family takes care of family." That evening, Isabella stood in the garden watching Marco practice his physical therapy exercises. The boy, no, the young man, moved with increasing confidence, his heart strong and steady, his future spreading out before him like a road with no end. "Mrs. Romano?" Marco called, noticing her watching. "Everything okay?" Isabella smiled, and it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. "Everything's perfect, Caro. I was just thinking about how lucky I am." "We're the lucky ones," Marco said, coming to stand beside her. "You know that, right? Everything good in this family, every moment of actual peace and love, it exists because you've been here, watching over us, keeping us human." Isabella looked up at this young man she'd raised, this boy who'd survived his heart trying to kill him and men who'd wanted to use him as a weapon, and saw hope. Real, genuine hope for a future that might be better than the past. "Marco," she said slowly, "if you could change this world, the one your father built, the one you'll inherit someday, what would you do differently?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd remember what you taught me, that people matter more than power, that love isn't weakness, that the greatest strength is knowing when to walk away from violence instead of toward it." He looked at her with eyes that held both his father's steel and something softer, something that might be her influence. "I'd try to be worthy of the woman who saved my life. Twice." Isabella felt her heart swell with pride and hope and the bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that her 42 years in the margins hadn't been wasted. She'd changed this family, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through steady, patient love and the refusal to let them forget their humanity. As night fell over the Moretti estate, Isabella returned to her kitchen one last time. She stood at the counter, hands buried in flour, and thought about all the lives she'd lived. The fierce young woman who'd loved Antonio Calabrese, the frightened immigrant who'd fled to America, the careful servant who'd spent decades watching from the shadows, and finally, the woman she'd become through it all. She thought about Antonio dying at peace because she'd come back to him. About Dr. Chen and his daughter Emma, starting fresh somewhere far from violence. About Marco, recovered and strong and learning to lead with compassion instead of fear. About Dante, slowly understanding that power without humanity was just tyranny wearing an expensive suit. And she thought about herself, 73 years old, with arthritic hands and eyes that had seen too much, but also with a family that loved her, a villa in Tuscany waiting whenever she chose to claim it, and the knowledge that she'd spent her life making the world incrementally better in small, significant ways. The bread dough was perfect beneath her hands, elastic and alive, full of potential. Isabella shaped it carefully, placed it in the pan, and set it aside to rise. Tomorrow, it would feed the people she loved. Tomorrow, it would be transformed by heat and time into something nourishing and essential. Just like her. In the world of the Morettis, a world built on violence and maintained through fear, Isabella Romano had carved out a space where love could exist. Complicated, messy, imperfect love, but real nonetheless. She'd learned to love men with blood on their hands without losing herself. She'd learned to build family in the margins of an empire without being consumed by it. And most importantly, she'd learned that the greatest power wasn't control or fear, but the quiet strength of showing up day after day and choosing compassion over convenience. As she turned off the kitchen lights and headed to her room, Isabella passed by the hallway where photos of the Moretti family hung in gilded frames. Dante as a baby, his father and grandfather, and there, in a new frame she hadn't noticed before, was a photo from Marco's hospital recovery. Isabella sitting beside his bed, their hands clasped, both of them smiling despite the machines and tubes and uncertainty. Someone had written on the frame in elegant script, "Family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when it matters most." Isabella touched the frame gently, feeling the truth of those words settle into her bones. She'd shown up. For 42 years, through every crisis and every quiet moment between, she'd shown up. And in doing so, she'd proven that love could survive even in the darkest corners of the world, not by denying the darkness, but by being a light steady enough to withstand it. Tomorrow, the bread would rise. The household would wake. Life would continue in its complicated, beautiful, dangerous way. And Isabella would be there, watching from the margins, holding the moral center, reminding everyone what it meant to be human in a world that often forgot. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a young woman in Calabria, saying yes to Antonio Calabrese's proposal. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of when she first came to America with nothing but hope and determination. But it was her life, built choice by choice, sacrifice by sacrifice, moment of compassion by moment of compassion. And looking back, across 73 years, Isabella Romano, once Isabella Russo, once the woman who walked away from an empire, could finally say with certainty, it had all been worth it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.